An orphanage is a residential institution devoted to the care of orphans, children whose biological parents are deceased or otherwise unable or unwilling to care for them. Biological parents, and sometimes biological grandparents, are legally responsible for supporting children, but in the absence of these, no named godparent or other relatives willing to care for the children, they become a ward of the state, and orphanages are one way of providing for the care, housing and education. It is frequently used to describe institutions abroad, where it is a more accurate term, since the word orphan has a different definition in international adoption. Most children who live in orphanages are not orphans. 4 out of 5 children in orphanages having at least one living parent and most having some extended family. Most orphanages have been closed in Europe and North America. There remain a large number of state-funded orphanages in the former Soviet bloc, but they are slowly being phased out in favor of direct support to vulnerable families and the development of foster care and adoption services where this is not possible. Few large international charities continue to fund orphanages. However, they are still commonly founded by smaller charities and religious groups, especially in developing countries. Orphanages may prey on vulnerable families at risk of breakdown and actively recruit children to ensure continued funding. Orphanages in developing countries are rarely run by the state. Other residential institutions for children can be called group homes, children's homes, refuges, rehabilitation centers, night shelters, or youth treatment centers. History. The Romans formed the first orphanages around 400 AD. Jewish law prescribed care for the widow and the orphan, and Athenian law supported all orphans of those killed in military service until the age of 18. Plato says, orphans should be placed under the care of public guardians. Men should have a fear of the loneliness of orphans and of the souls of their departed parents. A man should love the unfortunate orphan of whom he is guardian as if he were his own child. He should be as careful and as diligent in the management of the orphan's property as of his own, or even more careful still. The care of orphans was referred to bishops and, during the Middle Ages, to monasteries. As soon as they were old enough, children were often given as apprentices to households to ensure their support and to learn an occupation. In medieval Europe, care for orphans tended to reside with the Church. The Elizabethan poor laws were enacted at the time of the Reformation, and placed public responsibility on individual parishes to care for the indigent poor. Foundling hospitals. The growth of sentimental philanthropy in the 18th century led to the establishment of the first charitable institutions catering for the orphan. The Foundling Hospital was founded in 1741 by the philanthropic sea captain Thomas Coram in London, England, as a children's home for the education and maintenance of exposed and deserted young children. The first children were admitted into a temporary house located in Hatton Garden. At first, no questions were asked about child or parent, but a distinguishing token was put on each child by the parent. On reception, children were sent to wet nurses in the countryside, where they stayed until they were about 4 or 5 years old. At 16, girls were generally apprenticed as servants for 4 years. At 14, boys were apprenticed into a variety of occupations, typically for 7 years. There was a small benevolent fund for adults. In 1756, the House of Commons resolved that all children offered should be received, that local receiving places should be appointed all over the country, and that the funds should be publicly guaranteed. A basket was accordingly hung outside the hospital. The maximum age for admission was raised from 2 months to 12, and a flood of children poured in from country workhouses. Parliament soon came to the conclusion that the indiscriminate admission should be discontinued. The hospital adopted a system of receiving children only with considerable sums. This practice was finally stopped in 1801, and it henceforth became a fundamental rule that no money was to be received. 19th century. By the early 19th century, the problem of abandoned children in urban areas, especially London, began to reach alarming proportions. The workhouse system, instituted in 1834, although often brutal, was an attempt at the time to house orphans as well as other vulnerable people in society who could not support themselves in exchange for work. Conditions, especially for the women and children, were so bad as to cause an outcry among the social reform-minded middle class. Some of Charles Dickens' most famous novels, including Oliver Twist, highlighted the plight of the vulnerable and the often abusive conditions that were prevalent in the London orphanages. Clamour for change led to the birth of the orphanage movement. The movement really took off in the mid-19th century, although orphanages such as the Orphan Working Home in 1758 and the Bristol Asylum for Poor Orphan Girls in 1795 had been set up earlier. Private orphanages were founded by private benefactors. These often received royal patronage and government oversight. Ragged schools, founded by John Pounds and the Lord Shaftesbury, were also set up to provide pauper children with basic education. Orphanages were also set up in the United States from the early 19th century, although under the influence of Charles Loring Brace. Foster care became a popular alternative from the mid-19th century. The Social Security Act of 1935 improved Social Security by authorizing aid to dependent children. A very influential philanthropist of the era was Thomas John Barnardo, the founder of the charity Barnardo's. Becoming aware of the great numbers of homeless and destitute children adrift in the cities of England and encouraged by the 7th Earl of Shaftesbury and the 1st Earl Cairns, he opened the first of the Dr. Barnardo's homes in 1870. By his death in 1905, he had established 112 district homes, which searched for and received waifs and strays, to feed, clothe and educate them. The system under which the institution was carried on is broadly as follows. The infants and younger girls and boys were chiefly boarded out in rural districts. Girls above 14 years of age were sent to the industrial training homes to be taught useful domestic occupations. Boys above 17 years of age were first tested in labor homes and then placed in employment at home, sent to sea, or emigrated. Boys of between 13 and 17 years of age were trained for the various traits for which they might be mentally or physically fitted. Deinstitutionalization. The deinstitutionalization of orphanages and children's homes program began in the 1950s, after a series of scandals involving the coercion of birth parents and abuse of orphans. Many countries accepted the need to deinstitutionalize the care of vulnerable children, that is, closed down orphanages in favor of foster care and accelerated adoption. Moreover, as it is no longer common for birth parents in Western countries to give up the children, and as far fewer people die of diseases or violence while their children are still young, the need to operate large orphanages has decreased. Major charities are increasingly focusing their efforts on the reintegration of orphans in order to keep them with their parents or extended family and communities. Orphanages are no longer common in the European community, and Romania in particular has struggled to reduce the visibility of its children's institutions to meet conditions of its entry into the European Union. It is important to understand the reasons for child abandonment, then set up targeted alternative services to support vulnerable families at risk of separation, such as mother and baby units and daycare centers. Comparison to alternatives. There is an increasing body of evidence that orphanages, especially large orphanages, are the worst possible care option for children. In large institutions, all children, but particularly babies, may not receive enough eye contact, physical contact, and stimulation to promote proper physical, social and cognitive development. In the worst cases, orphanages can be dangerous and unregulated places where children are subject to abuse and neglect. There is only one significant study which disputes this. It was carried out by Duke University. The researchers concluded that institutional care in America in the 20th century produced the same health, emotional, intellectual, mental, and physical outcomes as care by relatives, and better than care in the homes of strangers. One explanation for this is the prevalence of permanent temporary foster care. This is the name for a long string of short stays with different foster care families. Permanent temporary foster care is highly disruptive to the child and prevents the child from developing a sense of security or belonging. Placement in the home of a relative maintains and usually improves the child's connection to family members, whereas orphanages are intended to be reasonably permanent placements. Group homes may be used for short-term placements. They may be residential treatment centers, and they frequently specialize in a particular population with psychiatric or behavioral problems, e.g., a group home for children and teens with autism, eating disorders, or substance abuse problems, a child soldiers undergoing decommissioning. Criticism. Most of the children living in institutions around the world have a surviving parent or close relative, and they most commonly entered orphanages because of poverty. It is speculated that, flush with money, orphanages are increasing and push for children to join, even though demographic data show that even the poorest extended families usually take in children whose parents have died. Experts and child advocates maintain that orphanages are expensive and often harm children's development by separating them from the families, and that it would be more effective and cheaper to aid close relatives who want to take in the orphans. Scams. Visitors to developing countries can be taken in by orphanage scams, which can include orphanages created for the day or orphanages set up as a front to get foreigners to pay school fees of orphanage directors. Extended families. Alternatively, the children whose upkeep is being funded by foreigners may be sent to work, not to school, the exact opposite of what the donor is expecting. The worst even sell children. In Cambodia, some are bought from the parents for very little and passed on to Westerners who pay a large fee to adopt them. This also happens in China. In Nepal, orphanages can be used as a way to remove a child from the parents before placing them for adoption overseas, which is equally lucrative to the owners, who receive a number of official and unofficial payments and donations. In other countries, such as Indonesia, orphanages are run as businesses, which will attract donations and make the owners rich. Often the conditions orphans are kept in will deliberately be poor to attract more donations.